Yeah, you see my background, right? The Terracotta Warrior.
Absolutely, absolutely. We call him the first emperor, but what is it? Qin Shi Huangdi.
Yeah, 金世皇
I'm
帝.
probably getting all the pronunciation completely wrong. Lots of books about him over there, by the way. And Li Su, he's minister, chief minister, and all of that. As I said, most interesting man.
Yes.
Most extraordinary place. One day I would love to go, to be honest. I'd like to go to Xi'an altogether, to that area of Western China, because it's so important in Chinese history that I would love to go.
Yeah, Xi'an is a fascinating place. I've been there, but I would like to go back as well. It's just so many places you can see, you know. So, and do you know the Terracotta Warrior? At one point there was I think a German tourist. He actually dressed up and then paint his face and pretend to be one of the soldiers and standing there. It took them a while before somebody discovered that. So there was some.
How bizarre. How bizarre. People must be saying to themselves, these are very strange people indeed.
Yeah. Some people have some obsession about it. Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Let's start. So the JFK file released yesterday, and I mean, there's a lot going on, need to go through. So we don't know anything, but at least so far, there is no smoking gun, isn't it? That's pretty much what to expect, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, to be very clear, if there was a conspiracy, if the CIA really had decided to assassinate President Kennedy, which for all I know they did, they would hardly document the fact. So, I mean, it's not likely that we would see evidence of this kind in the archives. But, we are going to get quite a lot of information. It's increasingly clear what a violent and unstable individual Oswald was. And people like that are, quite easy to manipulate. And it's also absolutely clear that well before he is assassinated or allegedly assassinated Kennedy, the US authorities were very, very well aware of him and of what he was doing, and were keeping a close eye on him. And that begs lots and lots of questions. We will never get a final answer, but we will get much closer to the truth. And that's always something.
Yeah, for example, like a Jack Ruby, apparently that revealed that the two of them know each other, right? A few weeks before the assassination, they met in Jack Ruby's bar, So, but anyway, I'm sure there's a lot of things that if people dig it in.
No, I mean, exactly. I mean that, as far as I know, is new. That Ruby and Oswald actually knew each other and had met previously. As far as I'm aware, I mean, I haven't been looking at the Kennedy stories for some years now, but certainly that was not known until a couple of years ago. I mean, the entire assumption was that Ruby and Oswald had no actual knowledge of each other, but turns out they did know each other, and that is interesting and that is important. And one doesn't quite know what deductions to make from it, and we won't know until somebody has sifted through all of these documents properly and reached a conclusion, and we'll see.
Well, at least I think what we can say now is the official narrative doesn't stand, that it doesn't hold the official. That much I think people can pretty much agree on that. It's just not the whole truth.
Absolutely. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I mean, the only question for me is this. First of all, there was a conspiracy and there was a cover-up. About that, there's absolutely no doubt. No doubt at all in my mind. The only question is this: was it a cover-up of complete incompetence by the American security agencies that weren't protecting Kennedy properly, didn't take sufficient steps to control Oswald, that weren't protecting Kennedy's motorcade, all of that kind of thing? Or, I mean, so were they concealing their incompetence? or their complicity in his murder. And I think this is the one question at the moment we don't quite have the answer to. But that there was a conspiracy within the security services, of that there is no doubt. There might have been a wider, even if it was just negligence on the part of the security services, don't forget that doesn't preclude a wider conspiracy by other people. I mean, Ruby definitely had connections with organized crime, for example, and maybe they were involved. Maybe they were involved in this assassination, and I suspect there's long been suggestions and clues that so did Oswald, by the way.
Yeah. All right. Trump and Putin had a phone call, a long phone call, like 3 hours. I think what they agreed is they call it a partial ceasefire, which is energy and infrastructure ceasefire. And I don't feel like Trump get a whole lot, honestly. And then follow that, Zelensky said that the civilian infrastructure was still hit after the phone call. And he said he's going to speak to Trump about the next step. What is your take on the whole thing?
Right. Well, I think the important thing to say about the attacks on the energy infrastructure is that it's only for 30 days. The Russians conduct their missile strikes at intervals of around 30 days. They've just conducted a big strike on Ukraine's infrastructure. So if we look at it in that respect, I mean, they haven't really conceded very much at all, because it's most unlikely that they would have been planning another missile strike anytime soon. I mean, that's the usual pattern in attacks of this kind. So I don't think the Russians have actually conceded very much. The Americans have, in their attempt to spin this, have not drawn much attention to the fact that this is only for 30 days. Now, 30 days, however, does provide an opportunity. It does mean that the Russians, even if it's only a token concession, have given Trump something to go away with. And the major thing that's come out of this meeting, the thing that's worrying Zelensky, and I suspect once they fully understand it, the thing that's going to really upset the Europeans, is that the discussion, the agreement between Putin and Trump, the one that really matters, is that they're going to set up expert groups to study how to solve this problem, and that they're going to discuss resolution of this problem bilaterally. As a matter of fact, I have the Russian readout in front of me. I'll just read out the relevant paragraph. The leaders confirmed their intention to continue efforts aimed at reaching a settlement in Ukraine bilaterally. Now, that means that since the Americans have accepted that this is a proxy war between the United States and Russia, the Americans and the Russians are going to negotiate the outcome with each other. So the Europeans have been cut out. The Ukrainians, to a certain extent, are being cut out as well. And Putin's number two, his deputy, Dmitry Medvedev, actually turn the knife on this. He emphasized the point in a really rather aggressive tweet that he said today. He said, it's from now on, it's America and Russia in the dining room. Ukraine is on the menu. So it's no longer going to be Ukraine and Russia. It's going to be America and Russia. And that is the biggest thing. And now that it is America and Russia, rather than Ukraine and Russia, we are probably going to move towards peace. That's my fundamental take of this whole readout.
Yeah, I also read that readout. One thing stand out for me is first of all, the Russian ones is much more. There's a lot more information than the American ones, I think.
Yeah.
Um, and then in the Russian ones,
It's
it
always true.
also
Can I just
yeah.
before you
Mhm.
continue, just before you continue, that's always the case.
It's-
The Americans provide readouts which hardly tell you anything. If the Americans are interacting with
Mhm.
any of the other two great powers, China or
Yeah.
Russia, you have to go to Chinese and
Yes.
Russian readouts to find out what was actually discussed. I
Uh-huh.
mean,
Yeah.
when you see a readouts, for example, between the Americans, between say Xi Jinping and the American president, the American readouts are about that long. And the Chinese readouts are like
Yeah.
this. I mean,
Yeah.
it is completely different. Russian readouts, just like Chinese readouts, are
Mhm.
always far more informative than
Mhm.
American readouts are. I don't know why that is so, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe it's because the Americans don't want to disclose the fact that the Russians and the Chinese are putting forward positions which the Americans basically don't want to admit to. But anyway, there it is. Anyway, carry on. Sorry for the
Yeah. One
interruption.
thing. Yeah. One thing that from the Russian standout is that they want to
Mm.
resolve this. They said it's something like a tackle the root of the problems. So, which seems to me
Yeah,
referring to
yeah,
the three requirements that Russia has been insisted on, right? One is no NATO membership, and of course the mistreatment of the Russian-speaking people within Ukraine, and also
mm,
denazification, which I guess my understanding is they wanted to be in
mm,
their constitution, Ukrainian constitution for the denazification. That
yeah,
seems like to me the three things
yeah.
that the Russian insisted on, and that hasn't changed. And the fact that they talk about the root of the problem seems to me that's what they're saying. Is that what it is?
That's absolutely correct. I mean, the Russians, Putin has not shifted an inch.
Uh-huh.
I mean, he went
Yeah.
into this meeting with Trump. He didn't agree to the 30-day ceasefire that the Americans were asking for. He said, "Look, you can't agree a ceasefire. The Ukrainians won't honor it. There'll be all of these problems. We can perhaps sort out these problems, but it will take time because the Ukrainians absolutely cannot be trusted. And if we're talking about a final agreement, we're winning the war, so it must be on our terms." That's basically what the Russians have said. So, there's been lots of talk, discussion about the Russians making concessions, about the Russians
Mhm.
being prepared to make, big moves to meet the Americans halfway. Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, said it a couple of days ago. He said the Russians are in no mood to make any concessions at all. This has
Mhm.
been a long-standing crisis for them. They've suffered an enormous amount of political damage in the West already. They don't take kindly to all the things the West is saying about them. They don't trust the West at all.
Mhm.
Putin has given an immense speech, by the way, just before he spoke to Trump, in which he said he doesn't expect the sanctions to be lifted.
Mhm.
Whatever happens,
Mhm.
even if there's peace, he doesn't expect the Americans to lift their sanctions or the West to lift their sanctions. So
Mhm.
the Russians are saying, look, absolutely, we want peace, but it must be on our terms.
Mhm.
And I'll tell you what my prediction is: the Americans will come round. They don't want a clear-cut defeat in Ukraine. They will do what they did with the Paris talks in the 1970s that ended the American involvement in the Vietnam War. They will do what they did in the Doha talks, which ended American involvement in Afghanistan. The Americans will come round. They will eventually concede all the main points that the Russians are insisting on. Because
Mhm.
what choice do they have?
Yeah, it's interesting. This is what New York Times posted on X, actually in Chinese. New York Times
Mm,
is pretty active, their Chinese version and English version. Anyway,
yeah.
so here's what New York Times says, what kind of Ukraine does Trump want? More like a Belarus or more like a Poland? It's clear which scenario is in Ukraine's interest and which scenario is in America's interest. But I don't know which scenario Trump thinks is in his personal interest. And that's the most important thing in Trump's Washington right now. I find that's the kind of interesting
Well,
comment.
again, I mean, it's a very interesting comment. It's also a fantastic one. I mean, what they basically want is a Ukraine that is a American ally, like Poland is, and they assume that that is in Ukraine's best interests. Trying to make Ukraine into a Poland, which remember is a NATO ally, and has destroyed Ukraine and has led to a war which Ukraine and by extension the United States is losing. If Ukraine can survive as a Belarus, that is an improvement over the alternative, which is its total defeat. So, I mean, it shows again the level of unreality there is.
Yeah. But I think I go with what you said, that I think the United States in the end will give the Russian pretty much everything Russian wants. I mean, like you said, what are the alternatives they have, right? So
what are the alternatives here? I mean, either you continue with the Biden policy, which will end ultimately in defeat. It may take a year, 2 years, probably not 2 years, by the way, given the realities on the ground. And we've just seen this disaster the Ukrainians have suffered in Kursk. Or you accept that you're not going to get what you wanted, that the Russians are going to get most of what they want, but you do a deal with them now before you are left with nothing. That it seems to me is the only realistic option left now.
Yeah, so I guess the answer to New York Times question is it's not even what Trump's personal interest is, it's just what is doable, right? Exactly. What is realistic. Yeah.
That's such a Chinese way of putting it, if I could say so. But you're absolutely right. It absolutely is. I mean, it's again, it's the pragmatism you find in China, but which in the West we've lost. The realism.
Yeah. If people can be more realistic, I think we save a lot of time. I think.
Well, indeed. Yeah. It didn't have to be this way. It didn't have to be this way. If we'd not tried to make Ukraine into Poland, it would have been in a better position than Belarus. Just saying. But, we insisted on trying to make it Poland. So it's going to end up, if it's lucky, like Belarus, if it's lucky.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, it could be worse. Yes, I agree. Yeah. All right. The Middle East seems in some kind of crisis. So Israel resumed the attack in Gaza, and this is a clear violation of the ceasefire agreement. And according to Caroline Leavitt, the spokesperson for the White House, she actually said that the White House was consulted before the attack, which means Trump gave Israel the green light to do so. What do you take on that?
Well, that's exactly. I mean, I've no doubt at all that is what happened. My own take on this is that Trump has become over-absorbed with Ukraine. He's giving far too much time on Ukraine. He was warned about this by many people, by Bannon, by others. Even Putin sort of warned him about this. And whilst he's been fixed on Ukraine, all sorts of other people in his administration, in Israel, have done what you would expect them to do. They've restarted the war that they always wanted to continue in the first place. And Trump, who has little understanding of these things, went along with it. I mean, because his instinct always is to side with the Israelis against everyone else. So we've got ourselves in this situation. I have no doubt that the initiative to restart the war came from Israel itself.
Well, but then here's the thing. Not only that, Israel also cutting off electricity and aid to Gaza, which of course is a violation of the ceasefire. So as a result of that, the Houthis resumes attacks for ships going to Israel. And as the result of that is the U.S. now bombing Yemen, and Yemen retaliated, attacking USS Truman. So it seems like the situation is escalating, isn't it?
Yes, it is escalating completely out of control. And again, Trump is not in control of the situation. He is drifting along, and he's drifting along to disaster. What he needed to do after he became president, he'd got the ceasefire in Gaza. He'd stabilized the situation to some extent with Iran. He said that he wanted to negotiate with Iran. He needed to keep Witkoff, who is his rather competent envoy, I get the sense, fully active and engaged in the Middle East. He needed to make very clear to the Israelis that if they broke the ceasefire, this would be completely unacceptable, and that they'd face his anger. And of course, instead of doing that, he lost interest in the whole Middle East situation as he tried to achieve peace with Putin and with Russia, which he's finding far more difficult, I suspect, than he expected. And the result is, as I said, he took his eye off the ball, and we are where we are. It's a very bad situation, and don't make the mistake of thinking that I'm defending Trump here. I'm blaming him because he is the person who ultimately ought to be maintaining control. He should have realized that Ukraine is a complicated business, that it's going to take a long time. Trying to sort out Ukraine in a few weeks never made any sort of sense. Whereas the situation in the Middle East was urgent and very dangerous and needed his full attention. So certainly he could have started something with Ukraine, and eventually that would have led to something. But he should have given himself at least a year and should have instead focused on keeping things under control in the Middle East, because you're absolutely right to set out the timeline. It was the Israelis who cut off the electricity supply to Gaza and started to interfere with food supplies there, who in effect broke the ceasefire. That caused the Houthis to respond. You can very easily see how Trump was then manipulated into launching attacks on the Houthis, and then the Israelis jumped in and began restarted their war against Gaza. So he's to blame for the fact that the situation has taken this violent and disastrous turn.
Well, because he has his eyes off the ball, it seems to me right now 3 aircraft carriers are heading now to the Middle East.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is it possible that he would just quietly walk into the war with Iran? I mean, that's a real risk, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And can I just say, the fact that those 3 aircraft carriers are heading to the Middle East, that to come back to Trump, somebody in Washington made that decision some time ago. Perhaps it was Trump, but this all looks to me like it was pre-prepared. Again, I can't help but think that Trump's focus on Ukraine, he's got people like Mike Waltz and Hegseth, fanatical Zionists, ardent supporters of Israel, people who hate Iran. And whilst Trump was distracted with Ukraine, they made this decision, and we see the whole way in which the thing has worked out. I don't mean to suggest, by the way, that they're being disloyal to Trump. No. I think they assume that Trump is on their side here. Yeah. It's just that probably they put this in front of him. They said, things are not looking good in the Middle East. We need to send the aircraft carriers. He didn't ask the questions which he needed to ask. That's not what Trump does. He didn't ask the questions. Why are we sending the carriers? What is the intelligence? He didn't give this the hours of time that he needed to. He didn't call Netanyahu. He didn't call the Egyptian president. He didn't call the Emir of Qatar. He didn't do any of those things. And the result is that we are where we are.
Yeah. And what Thomas Massey actually put on his X, I think it's somewhere. I think he summarized it pretty interesting. He said, as soon as we quit spending $50 billion per year at Afghanistan, we started spending $50 billion per year in Ukraine. Watch where the next $50 billion per year goes to when we stop sending it to Ukraine. that seems like a real possibility. We're going to tie it up in the Middle East, isn't it?
Absolutely. That is exactly where the United States is heading. One of the problems with Trump's team, and I've said this many times, is that he has filled it up with ex-middle rank army officers who have fought in the Middle East, in Iraq, in Libya, in all of these places. Now, these people feel very angry and betrayed by the forever wars, but they're viscerally anti-Iran. That includes Tulsi Gabbard, by the way, just to say. They are viscerally pro-Israel, and they are dangerous people to leave alone in a crisis in the Middle East. Either you control them or they control you, because when people have very strong feelings, they will follow those feelings. They always do.
Actually, in their phone call, one thing they did mention, the Russian readout, is that they seems like it did discuss the Middle East, which I guess it's a good thing that they did discuss that. So let's say, okay, I know maybe I'm a little bit idealistic, but let's forget about all those people around Trump. Let's say Trump, Putin, Xi Jinping. Do you think the three of them can get together? What can they do together to resolve this Middle East crisis, ideally?
Why, this is an excellent question, actually. Let's just first of all go to that Russian readout, because, again, it is extremely interesting. Because what it says is that the two countries will work together, will make joint efforts to stabilize the situation in the Middle East. So the Russians and the Americans are going to work together, according to this readout. We don't know that this is actually going to happen, but that's what Putin and Trump said they would do with each other to stabilize the situation in the Middle East. It also talked about nuclear proliferation and the need to, prevent that, which again hints at the Russians, Putin again repeating what is apparently an already existing Russian offer to mediate between the United States and Iran. Just saying, there's lots of hints that the Russians have been proposing this. So the Russians are telling Trump there's a mess in the Middle East. Of course, they're not going to tell him it's your mess, but they will say there's a mess in the Middle East. Let us work with you to try and sort it out. Now, the Russians have a certain amount of influence in the Middle East, but they're not the big power in the Middle East. The big power in the Middle East is still, by the way, the United States. We have to be frank about this. Iran is on very, very good terms with Iran. Russia is on very, very good terms with Iran. Russia is on very good terms with Iran. Russia has good relations with Saudi Arabia, and it's also got good relations with Egypt. And another important player, Iran and Egypt are both members of the BRICS. Who is the biggest and most powerful country in the BRICS? It's China. Bring them all together, and maybe you can start to move things forward. How do you stabilize the situation? It's very, very difficult to do, given the kind of people who are in charge of policy in Israel now. But why not go along with Wang Yi's proposal for an international conference to try to find a resolution to the conflict in the Middle East? I mean, that's probably the best way forward, but it will not be well received in Israel, and there will be people in the US who will oppose.
I think a peace conference, right, involve the parties all come together, start talking. I think that's probably a good first step. Okay.
Yes.
Trump, okay, the tariffs war. He still intends to introduce this reciprocal, they call it a reciprocal tariffs, to kick in on April 2nd. Among other things, he said that he want to take like 200% on European alcohol. All right. And of course, the whole Europe now.
No more Chateau Lafite for oligarchs and things like that in the US. Ever carry on.
Well, I pay attention to this actually because now I'm not a big alcohol
Yeah,
drinker, but I do buy European alcohol
yeah,
from time to time for my cooking. So, for example, I make my own vanilla
yeah.
extract, which I use absolute vodka, for example. So now I need to stock some.
Well, there you go.
But
Yeah.
anyway, so what kind of European? I mean, there is a panic now in Europe now. So what are they
Yeah.
going to do? Are they going to revenge or something? What other cards do they have to deal with this? The tariffs.
Well, they don't actually have that. They don't actually have that many cards because
Mhm.
um, even though the Europeans like to say that, in fact, there's no great trade imbalance between the United States and Europe because Europe imports American services from the United States. The reality is Europe is very dependent. It runs a significant surplus with the United States in trade in goods. And if tariffs are really about goods. So if the United States starts to levy tariffs on European goods being exported to the United States, that will affect European producers.
Mhm.
But because Europe imports far fewer manufactured goods from the United States, imposing countervailing tariffs probably isn't going to make that much of a dent to the
Mhm.
US. They could do other things. They could start putting restrictions on American social media platforms, for example.
Uh-huh.
I
Okay.
mean, they could, in theory, do those things. But the problem they have in that case is that there's no European social media platforms to take their place.
Uh-huh.
And we know that setting things up like that takes time.
Mhm.
And what are you going to do in the meantime? Are you going to deprive Europeans of all social media platforms?
Mhm.
So the reality here is that the balance of advantage is very much on the American side,
Mhm.
even if Europeans want to deny this.
And also, I just saw that the French, remember not that long ago, China actually imposed a 100% of tariffs on the French cognac, right? We talked about that. And so,
Yeah.
for whatever reason, the French now decided that, I guess, at the behest of the cognac lobby, so the French foreign minister just announced the plan to visit China to talk about just that. So it seems like, for
Yeah.
example, the French cognac industry is now being squeezed on the one side by China, and then now upcoming by the US. I got a
Mm.
feeling, I feel like Trump sometimes like to work with Russia, with China to squeeze the Europeans. Do you think that's something to
Yeah,
look
absolutely.
for?
Well, absolutely. I mean, as I'm sure, I think we discussed it previously. I mean, China is an enormous importer
Mhm.
of cognac. When I say enormous importer, I mean I don't mean everybody in China drinks French
Yeah.
cognac, but at the very high end, the premium end, China is a major market for French cognac. And I know a little bit about the French cognac producers. There's a few big companies. Um, um, but we're talking about growers
Mhm.
mostly. If there's a reduction, I mean, they will be very, very severely affected.
Mhm.
And of course, that is an important part, not just the French economy, but more perhaps of French society, of the French conception of themselves, that they produce these sort of goods and things. So it's going to be a very, very heavy blow for them.
Mhm.
But the Europeans themselves, to some extent, are doing this to themselves because they went into these economic wars with China, and of course,
Yeah.
even more so with Russia, at the instigation of the Americans. And now the Americans are turning on them.
Yeah.
So they should not have done that in the first place.
Yeah. Now they're in a difficult situation. We will see how they deal with
Mm,
it. Um,
mm, mm.
regarding Trump's tariff war, have you heard that there is a term called the Triffin Dilemma? So Triffin
Yeah.
Dilemma, yeah,
It's
you
from
heard
the
about that, right?
60s. It was an
Yeah, in the
economist, yeah, in the
60s.
60s, yeah.
Yeah. So what
Mm,
Triffin Dilemma, just for my audience, is that it's for a national currency like the United States dollar, right? To serve as a world primary reserve currency, there must be a sufficient liquidity in the global markets. And this requires the issuer country, the United States, to run a persistent trade deficit to supply other nations with its currency. Meaning you actually need a deficit to get your dollar out into the market, into the world, to make it a reserve currency. So what Trump wants is he doesn't like the deficit. He wants surplus, right? He wants more money coming back to the US and then US goods going out. But that means you collect the money from, US dollars from other countries. Well, then other countries don't have the dollar. They will try to find other currencies to trade. So you see, there is a dilemma, right? There is a conflict there. Do you think Trump think this through think this whole thing through?
I'm sure he hasn't. I'm sure everything about the way Trump is working suggests to me that this administration is improvising. On the one hand, they both want the dollar to remain the world's reserve currency, and they want the United States to run surpluses. I mean, they want contradictory things. They want to reindustrialize the United States, and I understanding very much what that implies, but they want policies that are inimical to reindustrialization, because one of the effects of tariffs, for example, is it's going to make the dollar stronger, at least in the short term, which will make it more difficult for the US to export. So they want all of these different contradictory things, and they haven't really worked out at all how to do this. Now, there is a good case for saying that the United States ought to be thinking about moving away from a situation where the dollar is a reserve currency. Way back in the 40s, John Maynard Keynes, who was the British representative to the Bretton Woods Conference, warned the United States about all of this. He said, do you really want your currency to be the world's reserve currency? Do you fully understand what that means? Why don't we set up artificial currency, the Bancor, that will be the world's reserve currency, so that the dollar isn't a reserve currency? I mean, we've had a reserve currency in Britain before, which is sterling, and that didn't work out very well for us. It did cause deindustrialization in Britain, from being the world's biggest industrial power in the mid-19th century. Already by the 1940s, we've been overtaken by many other countries. So do you really want to go through that pattern yourselves? But the Americans said, absolutely. We insist that the dollar must be the reserve currency. And over time, it's had exactly the effect that Keynes and Triffin said it would. The United States imports goods and it exports dollars. And as the United States has moved in recent years to self-sufficiency in energy with, shale and all of that, it's had to import more goods so that it can continue to export dollars, which has actually accelerated processes of deindustrialization in the United States. Now, there is a case for saying, forget about having the dollar as the reserve currency, except that can't continue for much longer. You've got to think beyond the dollar, and you've got to start perhaps working with other countries, China mostly, to see whether we can come up with some kind of long-term solution which will take the place of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. And that maybe is the most important thing you need to do if you really are serious about reindustrializing. Forget about tariffs. Forget about all of these other things. Focus on this central issue, which is what the dollar is doing to you. It may look like it's making you strong, but it's like an addiction at the end of the day. You feel good while you're taking the drug, but over time, it is weakening you. The trouble is the Americans can't even now see that, because they still continue to think of the dollar as the symbol of American strength. and the fact that everybody around the world uses the dollar is the symbol of American strength. So they're going around telling everybody, if you dare stop using the dollar, if you even think of setting up an alternative reserve currency, which, by the way, nobody's planning to do. Just to say, I mean, China isn't planning tomorrow to set up a reserve currency. China understands the Triffin dilemma very well, by the way, I should say. I mean, you follow Chinese economic writings, they don't talk about Triffin, but they've looked at this and they understand exactly what the problem with having a reserve currency is. Anyway, you could talk with the Chinese about this. There's even suggestions, which I've seen for some people, that if the United States wants to move away from the reserve currency system, from keeping the dollar as a reserve currency, it might even itself think about joining the BRICS, because all these platforms are being set up through the BRICS, which set up alternative mechanisms that look beyond reserve currencies. But of course, the United States, the great, all-powerful, almighty United States, can't bring itself to do that, because if it did, it will be another country working in the working in world trade alongside other countries. It would no longer be the exceptional country that sees further, knows better, does all of those things. And they've not yet reached that point where they're prepared to accept that. So you see all of these contradictions instead, all of these policies which don't really make any sense. They have a general feeling that things within the United States are going very badly wrong. But they're not really putting it all together and coming up with a coherent program about how to put it right in the way that, say, China did in the late 1980s, when in the late 1970s and early 1980s, as it moved forward with its own reform programs.
Well, it seems like the only thing they know is somehow to, I guess they call it limit China, right? To control China somehow. They're still trying to control China. So one of the example is the latest about the Panama Canal. So the two ports on the ports on both sides are now in the negotiation now that C.K. Hutchison, which currently is the owner of that, and now is selling it to BlackRock. Not just those two ports, there are other 43 ports, I think, altogether. It's a huge deal. Just so to share with you that this thing is really big in China, lots of discussion about that. The most significant part is this Da Gongbao, which is a newspaper in Hong Kong that many people believe is the mouthpiece of the Chinese government, and wrote an article saying, don't be naive, don't be confused. So that article was very critical, highly critical of Li Ka-Shing, the owner of C.K. Hutchison. And the Hong Kong and the Macau Affairs Office in the Chinese government republished this whole article on its website, which is highly unusual, which basically saying, read it, this is what you need to know. So now the deal is not finalized because it's now under investigation and scrutiny by the Hong Kong government. Hong Kong government just said that they're looking into it. But nonetheless, there's a lot of people very angry with Li Ka-Shing. And so the whole deal is now being seen as American bullying China. So what's your take on this whole thing?
Well, this is exactly true. And bullying China to what purpose at the end of the day? We've talked about the real problems that the United States has, why it needs to think through to arrive at proper solutions. And what is it doing instead? It's picking quarrels with China over things that ultimately are not important. I mean, it's all again about behaving like a bully, proving to yourself how strong you are, getting your way, annoying China, antagonizing China, creating problems between China and a particular businessman, which, all right, that's an internal matter in some respects. But it doesn't move, it doesn't ultimately help you. I mean, all of these things that Trump has been talking about, all of these various things, even Greenland and all that, these are not answers to America's underlying problems. And America does have time and space, in my opinion. It's a very rich country. It has the protection of the two oceans. It has a large and diversified economy. It has a large population. It has an abundance still of natural resources. And it has a strong science and technology base. If there was a purposeful government that knew how to put all of these things together and worked with other countries, especially, I mean, I have to say, especially China, you know, because China is so big and so strong now economically, you started to work with them. Then you could turn things around in the United States. You could bring things to order. But you're creating a fight with China. You are getting the Chinese to signal their extreme displeasure with you, because to be quite clear, it is the Chinese are not angry with this businessman. They're angry with the United States at the end of the day. In order to achieve what exactly? What are you gaining here? But it is the American mindset. They have been spoiled for so long by the fact that they could go around bullying other people, that it's a habit that they can't kick. And they think that if they bully a little bit more and bully small countries like Panama or even bigger countries like Canada, somehow that's going to make their situation better. When, of course, it's not.
I think one of the problems right now is that the U.S. kind of like not clear to me what kind of relationship even right now U.S. and China has. Because, okay, during World War II, you can say, you know, who is the enemy, right? You have a hot war with Germany. Okay, that's clear. And then you have the Cold War with the Soviet, which the two countries pretty much don't do much business at all, you know, each side on their own.
No.
Right now, we have a situation that China and the US is still doing a lot of business together, but clearly the US is very uncomfortable with everything about China. So what exactly, I mean, there is a war going on, clearly a tech war, a tariff war, a trade war, all kinds of wars going on. I mean, not a real battleground war, but so what kind of a relationship the US and China right now have? Do you have a word for it?
Well, a very, very complicated one. Neither war nor peace. We're not yet in a Cold War situation, because the Cold War had its own framework. I mean, you had two superpowers, which were rivals in the global system, with different economic systems, and they didn't trade very much, and they had very active diplomacy with each other, and they maintained very active diplomatic interchanges. But you know, that was basically all they did. I mean, they didn't trade. They each lived, if you like, in their own island. I mean, they had their own sphere of influence, and they traded with that. But that was all.
Yeah.
But China and the United States are in a completely different position. And the Americans haven't even thought it out for themselves, what exactly it is that they want from China. I mean, they haven't, in fact, but they have this sort of visceral feeling that because China's this big country and it's overtaken them as the world's biggest economy, which it has, that somehow violates what the Americans believe is the natural order of things, which is that America is always on top and everybody else is below them. And they somehow have this feeling that you must somehow push back against that. And it's making their policy towards China ever more bizarre and irrational. I mean, when China was poor, 50 years ago, it was much easier for the United States. Now that it's rich, well, that's very, very bad and very, very dangerous. And I think you're absolutely right to ask the question. And I have no simple word for it. It's a situation of neither war nor peace. It's not a Cold War like the Cold War of that we had between the Soviet Union and the United States, which had its rules and its philosophies, if you like. We have nothing like that between China and the United States now. We just have this constant tension and this constant conflict, and without any real understanding or thinking in Washington of what it is. And for China, by the way, this is very difficult, because how do you relate to a partner that is as confused as that? Because the confusion is entirely on the American side.
Now, regarding Li Ka-Shing, I just want to share with you, he actually is very much hated. It's actually not just.
Oh, I know. He's very unpopular. He's very unpopular here in Britain as well, by the way, just to say.
Well, he invested a lot in Britain, right? And he didn't make money out of the British investment. So anyway, so he actually had a little bit problem with Xi Jinping a long time ago, which I recently find out. So Xi Jinping, before he became the Chinese president, he was in Fujian province. So he was I don't know if you call it the governor, the head of the Fujian province. So he went into mainland China when China opened up, and he made a huge amount of money, taking advantage of the fact that the mainland China was in a transition and not a whole lot of rules and laws put in place in terms of for the real estate developers. He actually took advantage of that. And among other places in Beijing and in all the big cities, and the locals officials always gave him a green light until he got to Fujian. There was a historical old neighborhood. He wanted to build a tall building there, and Xi Jinping said no. I think this must upset him really very much, because he got Beijing, Shanghai, everywhere. Treated him like a king, and here you have Xi Jinping said no, you cannot build it there. It's a historical neighborhood. Just when I find out, actually, I have more respect for Xi Jinping, because one thing he did in Beijing I actually hate is there is a historical neighborhood in central Beijing. He developed the whole thing and destroyed a lot of the old neighborhood characters. I mean, for nothing. And among other things, there was actually a McDonald's at the heart of Beijing. There is a McDonald's. At the time was the largest McDonald's in the world. And it's like a tourist spot. It's not just the food itself, but also lots of people go there because it's packed with people, 2-3 floors, and it's just over the place. But it's kind of like a fun place for lots of kids going there. Young people go there. And then next to it is some older neighborhood, the Beijing neighborhood, with a lot of characters. And he basically tore down the whole area and built just like a box, those kind of typical modern building, which if you go today, there is no character at all. So I actually really hate that project. I'm not the only person in Beijing that hates that project. And so when I learned that the Xi Jinping said no to him, I actually have more respect for Xi Jinping. But that's also explained the two of them don't get along very well, just so you know.
That is very, very interesting. By the way, if you go to Moscow, you see the same. I mean, a lot of damage done by oligarchs in the 90s. There's a whole area around Red Square, very close to Red Square, actually, which was a whole kind of leisure development that was created there, which is hideous and makes absolutely no sense. And it was created in profoundly corrupt way, in exactly the way that you've just described. So he's also, by the way, since you've spoken about him, he's also very unpopular in Britain, and he used to bankroll the Conservative Party here, by the way, just to say, which maybe people in China don't know. No, absolutely, yeah. So he got an awful lot of things in Britain too. But there we go. I'm not surprised he's unpopular.
He has some title, right? Is the Queen gave him a title, so he's called a Sir or something? How does this work? What does those Sir means? Who gets it?
That the king calls you sir. That's all it means. I mean, it's once upon a time, it did mean something. It meant that you were a person of considerable eminence and things of that. It's a kind of honor. But to be honest, I mean, you said it's the Queen who gave it to him. It would have been the Conservative government that really gave it to him, because they draw up the lists, and basically he bought himself a knighthood. That's its called.
Okay, yeah. I didn't know that. I didn't know he was trying to, he was close to the Conservative Party. Okay.
Oh, yes, he was, absolutely. Yeah. Well, he wasn't close to the Conservative Party. He was paying the money in return for, I mean, it's exactly like what it sounds he was doing. Yeah. In China, he was going into places, doing what he wanted to do. People were letting him do it. And he found his friends, and he bought some of them, at least in Britain he did.
Yeah, he actually.
I'm not surprised about Xi Jinping, by the way. Everything I've heard about Xi Jinping, that is completely consistent with what I know about Xi Jinping. It's a very, very tough man.
Yeah.
I mean, this isn't something that people talk about much in the West, but he absolutely is. I mean, he's you know, very, very. He doesn't like corruption. He doesn't like things of that kind, and I can absolutely see how he might have shown the door to, well, we call him Li Ka-Shing here, but
Li
I
Ka-Shing,
presume, yeah, there we go. But anyway, there we are. Rupert Murdoch, another oligarch in Britain, who's walked all over us and done all kinds of things, and it's been exactly the same.
Sounds to me like Britain is not that independent country being run by the foreigners, foreign oligarchs, not just oligarchs, but foreign oligarchies.
No, it's not. I mean, we opened the door to oligarchs, and it's profoundly corrupted our politics and our social life, and it's distorted our economy, and it's done very, very bad things altogether. But this is a huge topic to discuss. Just the same.
Yeah, and Li Ka-Shing he's absolutely awful. He drives up the real estate prices in Hong Kong, and very manipulative to, like, for example, the environmentalists and the animal lovers. He would use them to stop building buildings and saying, oh, you hurt the ecosystem of this and that. But in reality, it's had nothing to do with the environment. It's just that he wanted to control the number of apartments being built. That's what he wanted. So just a very manipulative guy. Yeah. Anyway, Sam Altman, I mean, talking about the war, right? The tech war here. So Sam Altman now wants the US government to ban all the AIs from China.
Yeah.
And of course, not that long ago, Meta was lobbying hard to ban TikTok, right? And so can we say that the US companies don't really believe in fair competition? So we are not really in a capitalist country?
Well, that's absolutely true. They don't. I mean, they never have done. I mean, this has always been a fiction, in my opinion. The Americans are all in favor of free trade and fair competition, provided it benefits them or it affects other people. But when it comes to themselves, what it's all about. By the way, I think what capitalism ultimately is all about is making money. I mean, people want to make money. Businesses want to make money. When I say businesses, I mean, we're not talking about businesses. We're talking about massive corporate leviathans. They want to make money, and they're going to rig the market to suit them. Many decades ago, when I was a very young man, I worked for a time in a law firm that did work for the music industry. I mean, the rock music industry, even though I detest rock music. I'm never going to go into that. And one of the things I very, very quickly discovered is how the audiences in music were completely manipulated, how there would be decisions made, by the record companies to make certain particular rock groups immensely popular. I was told, I'm not going to name it because it still exists, one particular rock group, completely unknown at that time. I remember being told that CBS has decided that they're going to be number one. And I saw how it was done. And the reason was very simple, because they're putting a huge investment into this particular rock group, and they want to see a return on it. And it's exactly the same with everything else. Markets are rigged. That is the nature of capitalism, that is always the system that capitalism eventually devolves into. And that's the United States. They do not want competition. They certainly don't want competition from China, because they know the Chinese ultimately are better than at this than they are. It's as simple as that.
Well, it's interesting because people are calling China a communist country, but actually the Chinese government encourages competition. If you look at any industry in China, the internet, different platforms, there are at least 7, 8 platforms competing with each other. You look at the EV, there's many EV cars that are all competing fiercely against each other. Phones, that's another one. There's just always a lot of competition going on, which I think explains why they come out with an AI. There's a lot of companies doing AI as well, different AI models, and that explains why China, in terms of their products, are cheaper, better quality, because they have to constantly innovate. I thought the United States understand this. If you want a strong United States, you need to have competition in order to have the best product, the best service, best innovations. And look at the Chinese government, even in the midst of all this tech war and trade war, China hasn't punished Tesla or Apple, because China knows this is important to have Tesla and Apple in China to compete with the Chinese company. It's good for China. How come the United States doesn't understand that?
Well, because first of all, I think the thing to say is that the Chinese government has a completely different economic and social philosophy to what you have in the United States. They are not motivated by profit in the same way. They are motivated by product, by if you like, the welfare. The larger welfare of Chinese society. That isn't true to the same extent in the United States. So you have a completely different perspective. In the United States, as I said, it's a system which has devolved increasingly into an increasingly small, narrow, particularly in tech, a very narrow group of people who basically want to make as much money as they can. And if they will rig the market in their favor. In China, on the contrary, they think things. I don't want to, start attaching ideological labels to this, but they're still trained in Marxist thinking, if I can put it like that. So that they understand markets better in some ways, and the role that markets have, because they're trained to think in this way, and their conception of what they want to achieve is different from what you see in the United States. So absolutely, that is why they have competition in China. And yes, you're absolutely right. It's been proved many times that where there is competition, rather than crony capitalist corrupted behemoths, that's where you're going to get a lot more innovation. China does it. China does it. The United States doesn't. The United States thinks in a different way.
I think this fact that the U.S. government is so protective of its government, and it's a company. I mean, protective, I have to use the word. They're very protective of some, small number of companies that it's actually overall it's hurting the United States because you stifle the competition. And making companies, I mean, look at Boeing, for example, right? They're so comfortable. They don't feel the needs for innovation, right? So they're not making advances. So,
They're not making advances. As we all know, their quality controls started to weaken. Their engineering has started to weaken because they have no incentive to do better. There's no reason to. We see this, by the way, in the performance of their weapons in Ukraine, which have not done very well because, again, their arms industry is entirely monopolist. Now, there's a very interesting article in Global Times which compared the way China produces weapons and the way the United States does, and it says in arms industry in China is a byproduct of the much bigger civilian manufacturing economy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Whereas it isn't in the US in the same way. So again, you see that the Chinese are able to put up a 6th-generation fighter jet, and the Americans, as you pointed out, are pretending that it doesn't even exist. I mean, things of that kind. So this is the difference. This is the fundamental difference in economic philosophies. And you're absolutely right. Protecting big corporate institutions in this kind of way so that they become focused on wealth extraction as opposed to wealth production is ultimately going to undermine your technological and manufacturing capabilities. The best economist who discusses this really well is Michael Hudson, by the way. We've done programs with him on the Duran, but he writes about this all the time, and talks about this all the time, and he points out that a lot of this was all understood by 19th century economists, but they're not read anymore in the West because the culmination of economic thinking in the 19th century was Marx, who basically brought it all together. And Marx is, of course, a prohibited writer in the West. He's not taught any longer in economics departments in the West, which, by the way, he used to be as recently as the 1960s.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, unfortunately, I think actually he has a lot of good points, Marxist. And whether you agree or you disagree, I think people need to be aware of his theories, right? And there are certain parts of them are making sense. You should at least understand, what he's talking about. But it's wholly dismissed now by the West. Yeah.
It is wholly dismissed by the West, which doesn't just mean that Marx isn't read, but all of the other economists of that era, people like Friedrich List, for example, aren't being read either, because that whole body of economic thought in the West, which explained these very things, that you need competition, that unless society or government or whatever you like plays a role in maintaining that competition, you will devolve towards monopoly, and monopoly leads to oligarchy. That's all been discussed and researched and thought about. But if you go to economics departments today in the West, and I have done so, it's now all completely sterile. It's all based on very complicated mathematical modeling. They don't look at these societal aspects that underpin economics, which, of course, you still find in China. I think in China, by the way, maybe Marx does play a role in this, but I suspect that there's also within wider Chinese society, there are traditions and cultural aspects that play a role to this, which it's not so easy for us to understand in the West.
Yeah, it's a combination of things, yes, and it's interesting that the Marxist ideas lots of times actually matches well with some parts of the Chinese society. Actually, it's kind of interesting. One more thing. Radio Free Asia and Voice America now being shut down. Okay. And that's another topic lots of people are talking about in China. So it's welcome by people in China, I think around the world probably. What I feel like the thing is that Donald Trump himself and Elon Musk, they don't believe in these kind of ideological, right, trying to influence people that way, these kind of propaganda. But also, I think they also probably are correct to realize that these kind of traditional media is no longer that effective, isn't it?
Correct. Absolutely correct. This is absolutely correct. So, I mean, looking at it from a purely business perspective, it's a complete waste of money. I mean, it's not achieving the results that it once did. So I think this is absolutely true. Having said that, it is a good thing that these things, these horrible things, are having the plug pulled. It's time overdue that it was, actually. And the thing to always remember about all of these horrible media entities, which aren't really media entities, is that they also shape opinion in the United States and in the West, in the sense that the people who run them are politically and ideologically committed to a certain cause, and they have influence in the United States itself. So closing them down pulls the rug underneath these people. They're suddenly less important in Washington than they were previously. You see, this is where the whole Trump phenomenon is so complicated, because they are confused about so many things, but they still have, moments of insight that you will never find, you wouldn't have found, for example, from the Biden people.
Oh yeah.
So it's a very difficult administration to explain. It, as I said before, it has this sense that there is an awful lot that's going wrong, and sometimes their instincts take them to the right places, like closing down these horrible entities. But at the same time, they have no real clear overall conception of what they need to do, because doing that is an imaginative challenge too far. It means recognizing that there's more things wrong with the United States that even they can admit to.
Yeah, it's totally correct. I mean, in deep down, I really want to see some real changes. It's just simple things like the Doge. They fired lots of people from in IRS. Oh, it sounds great, because IRS, everybody hates IRS. But you look at the people they fired are the people who are supposedly to audit corporations. Well, that's not what the people you should fire. You want, in fact, I think they should put in probably better training for a lot of people. I just recently received 2 letters from IRS telling me that I own some taxes. I know I paid them like a month ago. Somehow they didn't get into their system or something. So I have to, take screenshots of the payment that I've done, and then work with my accountant. And she said she's going to contact them, because calling them is a nightmare. So I'm glad that my accountant could do it. But it's actually these kind of things that they need some real reform to train the people better, make their system work better, those sort of things, and not just simply firing people. But that's not what they're doing, with the IRS, for example. It's just so unfortunate. I find that, I think you're right that he is like a Gorbachev, that he sees some problem, but he doesn't seem to have a grasp of how to solving the problem. Right?
Exactly. It is very like Gorbachev, because it's exactly the kind of mistake that Gorbachev made. And you see, the problem is, by the way, I've had exactly the same problem with the inland revenue here. And one shouldn't laugh too much, because all right, you solve it, but it takes up so much of your time, which you could be using for other things. And you go to your accountant, and then you have to pay your accountant. So for a problem on their side, which you will never be compensated for. So it is exhausting, and it's demoralizing at the end of the day. Now, these are the problems, as you absolutely rightly say, that you could change. If you did change to that, it would improve people's welfare and their quality of life. And these small things, and they may look like small things, they take time to work through, but beyond a certain critical point, people do notice the difference. But you don't do that. You see, if you're Gorbachev, or dare I say Trump, you go for things that look relatively easy. So you unleash Doge, you put a businessman in charge of Doge, you tell yourself something which is, by the way, always wrong, that businessmen are the right people to sort things out, because business people know about these things, which they don't, by the way. Business people are clueless about how public sector things work, I should say. But anyway, you put a businessman in charge, you sort it out like a business. So what does the businessman do? He goes off and he changes that part of the IRS which is concerning to businessmen like him.
Yeah.
I mean, that's ultimately what this is going to end up with. And everybody else is left in exactly the same position that they were left in before.
Yeah. All right. Let's talk next Wednesday.
Let's talk next Wednesday. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.